Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
I read your article a long time ago about Bruce Lee when I wrote about the Bruce Lee and anti-imperialism of Kung Fu. Right? I'm not sure if you're a Kung Fu fan, but I am. You advocated a polyculture view of the world as one of the gut instinct we share. Bruce Lee, well, it's kind of shame he is still one of the most popular Asian figure. There's no second Bruce Lee or third Bruce Lee that can replace or even approach the Asian figures in US. He is popular, but the systematical discriminations on Asian, they love Bruce Lee, but ignoring his racial identity as Asian. So how the first immigrating group to face racial exclusionary barrier, they can treat him as supreme figure, but at the same time hating Asian that much. Not only Chinese, but also, Indians or those from Philippines.
Look, nobody can match Bruce Lee because of the time, the moment when his films came out. I'll come back to him. But, there have been smaller versions. Yao Ming, for instance, became a big hero when he was in the National Basketball Association. And he is a very charismatic person. Yao Ming has a kind of a very nice personality and so on. But Bruce Lee was an icon. And there are a couple of maybe 3 reasons why I feel Bruce Lee was an icon. The first thing is that you have to understand that Bruce Lee was one of the first Chinese stars in a mainstream US Hollywood TV show.
Yeah.
This is the Green Hornet. He had a speaking role where he was not the quote-unquote Chinaman. In cowboy movies, there was often a Chinese person who ran a shop in a small town. In John Wayne films, and he would be called Chinaman. And, there were all kinds of racist attitudes and so on in those films. He would have a queue, they would make fun of the queue and so on. And this was in going alongside the anti-Chinese sentiment in California and in the western states of the United States. Chinese immigrant and then Asian immigration was banned into the US in the 1920s for 40 years till the 1960s. Bruce Lee is interesting. Bruce Lee comes during the early part of the civil rights movement.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy. Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other.
Black students had been killed already, but because of the racism that is so deeply embedded in this country, the reaction came only when white students were killed. Because I maintain that racism does not benefit the masses of white people, and that white people have just as much an interest in fighting racism as black people and Chicanos and Puerto Ricans and Native Americans and Asians and
He enters the show Green Hornet as a kind of a semi-star, but this is not when Bruce Lee takes off, because there were Latino actors as well. You know, in I Love Lucy, Desi Arnaz was husband in the show as well, and so on. But this was not the main thing. Bruce Lee could have been in the Green Hornet; it could have ended. But when the Asian American movement takes off in the United States, when the Red Guard movement in California, when I Wore Ken in New York City and so on, when young Asians in the 1960s started to demand equal rights, and when the law changed in 1965 and new Asian migrants could enter the United States, it's at that moment that Bruce Lee decides to make films not in the United States. That's interesting. He was already a Hollywood star, but he goes to Hong Kong. He goes and makes films in Hong Kong. It's in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong studio world. Hong Kong has an old martial arts filming tradition, very old films. But Bruce was a genius because he brought to the Hong Kong world a kind of sophistication. I have nothing against Chinese films, but if you watch the old Kung Fu movies, there's a lot of, everything breaking down and so on. Bruce Lee, actually, in the work I did in talking to people around him and so on, he works very closely with the producers there. He wasn't just the actor. In shaping narratives for these films, they were inspired by the Western, the concept of the Western. And if you go back and look at Enter the Dragon or Return of the Dragon, these are real movies. They are narrative plots. They are not just, the movie begins with six fellows from a dojo coming in and smashing up another group and whatever. These are really interesting plots. And underneath the plot is a genuine anti-imperialist sensibility that actually is about the US war in Vietnam. That plays a role in these films. If you go and watch Enter the Dragon, it's an anti-imperialist film. It's a beautiful movie. But also Bruce is a beautiful person, is extremely good looking. That helps. He uses Kung Fu in the film, not to overwhelm the film, but only part of it. And remember that scene fought in the Colosseum in Rome, which is like an emblem of Western civilization. Yeah. Bruce Lee, the Chinese guy, dressed in what effectively looked like Vietnamese Viet Cong uniform, is fighting against Chuck Norris, who looks like a US Marine, and he defeats him. He defeats him. Yeah. So in a sense, the Asian from the rice field is defeating the US Marine in the Colosseum. That's the reason why Bruce Lee films became immensely popular in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and so on. He's a global icon. And he's a global icon because he's an anti-imperialist figure. And I very much hope that you would bring your audience back to watching Bruce Lee films.
Yeah, of course, I love it.
Coming to terms with the fact that, this is not just a Kung Fu film. Again, not to disparage Kung Fu movies, but look, there's miles between Bruce Lee's films and Jackie Chan. Jackie Chan is entertainment. Bruce Lee was not only about entertainment, he was about giving you a sense of the history of that moment. And you got to see, if you watch Enter the Dragon again, there is a black character in that film who is a leading star in the quote-unquote blaxploitation or African film at the time, who was in a film called Black Belt Jones. Super film, you know. If you see Black Belt Jones, the reason I'm thinking about this is Enter the Dragon comes out in 1973. It's an anti-imperialist film. Black Belt Jones with the lead star Jim Kelly comes out in 1974. That's a film against gentrification in the Black community in Los Angeles. These are political films of the moment. Jim Kelly himself becomes an iconic figure, you know, of that era.
Yeah.
I wrote that article, to be perfectly frank with you. I love Bruce Lee. When I was a child, I had a big poster of him in my room. He captivated me. And what captivated me? It was the 1970s. What captivated me was that there was this guy who, you know, was Chinese, and he was out there saying, I want to stand up with my back straight. I don't want to bend in front of people who are powerful. Wow. It's good for kids to see that.
Eat. This time you're eating paper. Next time it's gonna be glass.